She squatted once again, and when she let her fingers open, a most astonishing display of lights emanated from them. The sky was filled with thick rays of light. It was a spellbinding sight. I became engrossed in it, my eyes were fixed. I was not paying attention to La Gorda. I was looking at the lights. I heard a sudden outcry that forced me to look at her, just in time to see her grab one of the lines she was creating and spin to the very top of the canyon. She hovered there for an instant like a dark, huge shadow against the sky, and then descended to the bottom of the gully in spurts or small leaps, or as if she were coming down a stairway on her belly. I suddenly saw her standing over me. I had not realized that I had fallen on my seat. I stood up. She was soaked in perspiration and was panting, trying to catch her breath. She could not speak for a long time. She began to jog in place. I did not dare to touch her. Finally she seemed to have calmed down enough to crawl back into the cave. She rested for a few minutes. Her actions had been so fast that I had hardly had any time to evaluate what had happened. At the moment of her display I had felt an unbearable, ticklish pain in the area just below my navel. I had not physically exerted myself and yet I was also panting. "I think it's time to go to our appointment," she said, out of breath. "My flying opened us both. You felt my flying in your belly, that means you are open and ready to meet the four forces." "What four forces are you talking about?" "The Naguals and Genauro's allies. You've seen them. They are horrendous. Now they are free from the Naguals and Genauro's gourds. You heard one of them around Soledad's house the other night. They are waiting for you. The moment the darkness of the day sets in, they'll be uncontainable. One of them even came after you in the daytime at Soledad's place. Those allies now belong to you and me. We will take two each. I don't know which ones. And I don't know how, either. All the Nagual told me was that you and I would have to tackle them by ourselves." "Wait, wait!" I shouted. She did not let me speak. She gently put her hand over my mouth. I felt a pang of terror in the pit of my stomach. I had been confronted in the past with some inexplicable phenomena which Don Juan and Don Gennauro had called their allies. There were four of them and they were entities, as real as anything in the world. Their presence was so outlandish that it would create an unparalleled state of fear in me every time I perceived them. The first one I had encountered was Don Juan's. It was a dark, rectangular mass, 8 or 9 feet high and 4 or 5 feet across. It moved with the crushing weight of a giant boulder and breathed so heavily that it reminded me of the sound of bellows. I had always encountered it at night, in the darkness. I had fancied it to be like a door that walked by pivoting on one corner and then on the other. The second ally I came across was Don Genauro's. It was a long-faced, bald-headed, extraordinarily tall, glowing man, with thick lips and enormous, droopy eyes. He always wore pants that were too short for his long, skinny legs. I had seen those two allies a great many times while in the company of Don Juan and Don Gennauro. The sight of them would invariably cause an irreconcilable separation between my reason and my perception. On the one hand, I had no rational ground whatsoever to believe that what was happening to me was actually taking place, and on the other hand, there was no possible way of discarding the truthfulness of my perception. Since they had always appeared while Don Juan and Don Gennauro were around, I had filed them away as products of the powerful influence that those two men had had on my suggestible personality. In my understanding it was either that, or that Don Juan and Don Gennauro had in their possession forces they called their allies, forces which were capable of manifesting themselves to me as those horrendous entities. A feature of the allies was that they never allowed me to scrutinize them thoroughly. I had tried various times to focus my undivided attention on them, but every time I would get dizzy and disassociated. The other two allies were more elusive. I had seen them only once, a gigantic black jaguar with yellow glowing eyes, and a ravenous, enormous coyote. The two beasts were ultimately aggressive and overpowering. The jaguar was Don Gennaro's and the coyote was Don Juan's. La Gorda crawled out of the cave. I followed her. She led the way. We walked out of the gully and reached a long, rocky plain. She stopped and let me step ahead. I told her that if she was going to let me lead us, I was going to try to get to the car. She shook her head affirmatively and clung to me. I could feel her clammy skin. She seemed to be in a state of great agitation. It was perhaps a mile to where we had left the car, and to reach it we had to cross the deserted, rocky plain. Don Juan had shown me a hidden trail among some big boulders, almost on the side of the mountain that flanked the plain toward the east. I headed for that trail. Some unknown urge was guiding me, otherwise I would have taken the same trail we had taken before when we had crossed the plain on the level ground. La Gorda seemed to be anticipating something awesome. She grabbed onto me. Her eyes were wild. "Are we going the right way?" I asked. She did not answer. She pulled her shawl and twisted it until it looked like a long, thick rope. She encircled my waist with it, crossed over the ends and encircled herself. She tied a knot and thus had us bound together in a band that looked like a figure 8. "What did you do this for?" I asked. She shook her head. Her teeth chattered but she could not say a word. Her fright seemed to be extreme. She pushed me to keep on walking. I could not help wondering why I was not scared out of my wits myself. As we reached the high trail, the physical exertion began to take its toll on me. I was wheezing and had to breathe through my mouth. I could see the shape of the big boulders. There was no moon but the sky was so clear that there was enough light to distinguish shapes. I could hear La Gorda also wheezing. I tried to stop to catch my breath but she pushed me gently as she shook her head negatively. I wanted to make a joke to break the tension when I heard a strange thumping noise. My head moved involuntarily to my right to allow my left ear to scan the area. I stopped breathing for an instant and then I clearly heard that someone else besides La Gorda and myself was breathing heavily. I checked again to make sure before I told her. There was no doubt that that massive shape was there among the boulders. I put my hand on La Gorda's mouth as we kept on moving and signaled her to hold her breath. I could tell that the massive shape was very close. It seemed to be sliding as quietly as it could. It was wheezing softly. La Gorda was startled. She squatted and pulled me down with her by the shawl tied around my waist. She put her hands under her skirt for a moment and then stood up. Her hands were clasped and when she snapped her fingers open a volley of sparks flew from them. "Piss in your hands," La Gorda whispered through clenched teeth. "Hub?" I said, unable to comprehend what she wanted me to do. She whispered her order 3 or 4 times with increasing urgency. She must have realized I did not know what she wanted, for she squatted again and showed that she was urinating in her hands. I stared at her dumbfounded as she made her urine fly like reddish sparks. My mind went blank. I did not know which was more absorbing, the sight La Gorda was creating with her urine, or the wheezing of the approaching entity. I could not decide on which of the two stimuli to focus my attention, both were enthralling. "Quickly. Do it in your hands." La Gorda grumbled between her teeth. I heard her, but my attention was dislocated. With an imploring voice La Gorda added that my sparks would make the approaching creature, whatever it was, retreat. She began to whine and I began to feel desperate. I could not only hear but I could sense with my whole body the approaching entity. I tried to urinate in my hands, my effort was useless. I was too self-conscious and nervous. I became possessed by La Gorda's agitation and struggled desperately to urinate. I finally did it. I snapped my fingers 3 or 4 times, but nothing flew out of them. "Do it again," La Gorda said. "It takes a while to make sparks." I told her that I had used up all the urine I had. There was the most intense look of despair in her eyes. At that instant I saw the massive, rectangular shape moving toward us. Somehow it did not seem menacing to me, although La Gorda was about to faint out of fear. Suddenly she untied her shawl and leaped onto a small rock that was behind me and hugged me from behind, putting her chin on my head. She had practically climbed on my shoulders. The instant that we adopted that position, the shape ceased moving. It kept on wheezing, perhaps 20 feet away from us. I felt a giant tension that seemed to be focused in my midsection. After a while I knew without the shadow of a doubt that if we remained in that position we would have drained our energy and fallen prey to whatever was stalking us. I told her that we were going to run for our lives. She shook her head negatively. She seemed to have regained her strength and confidence. She said then that we had to bury our heads in our arms and lie down with our thighs against our stomachs. I remembered then that years before Don Juan had made me do the same thing one night when I was caught in a deserted field in northern Mexico by something equally unknown and yet equally real to my senses. At that time Don Juan had said that fleeing was useless and the only thing one could do was to remain on the spot in the position La Gorda had just prescribed. I was about to kneel down when I had the unexpected feeling that we had made a terrible mistake in leaving the cave. We had to go back to it at any cost. I looped La Gorda's shawl over my shoulders and under my arms. I asked her to hold the tips above my head, climb to my shoulders and stand on them, bracing herself by pulling up the ends of the shawl and fastening it like a harness. Years before Don Juan had told me that one should meet strange events, such as the rectangular shape in front of us, with unexpected actions. He said that once he himself stumbled upon a deer that talked to him, and he stood on his head for the duration of that event, as a means of assuring his survival and to ease the strain of such an encounter. My idea was to try to walk around the rectangular shape, back to the cave, with La Gorda standing on my shoulders. She whispered that the cave was out of the question. The Nagual had told her not to remain there at all. I argued, as I fixed the shawl for her, that my body had the certainty that in the cave we would be all right. She replied that that was true, and it would work except that we had no means whatever to control those forces. We needed a special container, a gourd of some sort, like those I had seen dangling from Don Juan's and Don Gennaro's belts. She took off her shoes and climbed on my shoulders and stood there. I held her by her calves. As she pulled on the ends of the shawl I felt the tension of the band under my armpits. I waited until she had gained her balance. To walk in the darkness carrying 115 pounds on my shoulders was no mean feat. I went very slowly. I counted 23 paces and I had to put her down. The pain on my shoulder blades was unbearable. I told her that although she was very slender, her weight was crushing my collarbone. The interesting part, however, was that the rectangular shape was no longer in sight. Our strategy had worked. La Gorda suggested that she carry me on her shoulders for a stretch. I found the idea ludicrous. My weight was more than what her small frame could stand. We decided to walk for a while and see what happened. There was a dead silence around us. We walked slowly, bracing each other. We had moved no more than a few yards when I again began to hear strange breathing noises, a soft, prolonged hissing like the hissing of a feline. I hurriedly helped her to get back on my shoulders and walked another 10 paces. I knew we had to maintain the unexpected as a tactic if we wanted to get out of that place. I was trying to figure out another set of unexpected actions we could use instead of La Gorda standing on my shoulders, when she took off her long dress. In one single movement she was naked. She scrambled on the ground looking for something. I heard a cracking sound and she stood up holding a branch from a low bush. She maneuvered her shawl around my shoulders and neck and made a sort of riding support where she could sit with her legs wrapped around my waist, like a child riding piggyback. She then put the branch inside her dress and held it above her head. She began to twirl the branch, giving the dress a strange bounce. To that effect she added a whistle, imitating the peculiar cry of a night owl. After 100 yards or so I heard the same sounds coming from behind us and from the sides. She changed to another bird call, a piercing sound similar to that made by a peacock. A few minutes later the same bird calls were echoing all around us. I had witnessed a similar phenomenon of bird calls being answered, years before with Don Juan. I had thought at the time that perhaps the sounds were being produced by Don Juan, who was hiding nearby in the darkness, or even by someone closely associated with him, such as Don Gennaro, who was aiding him in creating an insurmountable fear in me, a fear that made me run in total darkness without even stumbling. Don Juan had called that particular action of running in darkness the Gate of Power. I asked La Gorda if she knew how to do the Gate of Power. She said yes. I told her that we were going to try it, even though I was not at all sure I could do it. She said that it was neither the time nor the place for that and pointed in front of us. My heart, which had been beating fast all along, began to pound wildly inside my chest. Right ahead of us, perhaps 10 feet away, and smack in the middle of the trail, was one of Don Gennaro's allies, the strange glowing man, with the long face and the bald head. I froze on the spot. I heard La Gorda's shriek as though it were coming from far away. She frantically pounded on my sides with her fists. Her action broke my fixation on the man. She turned my head to the left and then to the right. On my left side, almost touching my leg, was the black mass of a giant feline with glaring yellow eyes. To my right I saw an enormous phosphorescent coyote. Behind us, almost touching La Gorda's back, was the dark rectangular shape. The man turned his back to us and began to move on the trail. I also began to walk. La Gorda kept on shrieking and whining. The rectangular shape was almost grabbing her back. I heard it moving with crushing thumps. The sound of its steps reverberated on the hills around us. I could feel its cold breath on my neck. I knew that La Gorda was about to go mad. And so was I. The feline and the coyote were almost rubbing my legs. I could hear their hissing and growling increasing in volume. I had, at that moment, the irrational urge to make a certain sound Don Juan had taught me. The allies answered me. I kept on frantically making the sound and they answered me back. The tension diminished by degrees, and before we reached the road I was part of a most extravagant scene. La Gorda was riding piggyback, happily bouncing her dress over her head as if nothing had ever happened, keeping the bounces in rhythm with the sound I was making, while 4 creatures of another world answered me back as they moved at my pace, flanking us on all 4 sides. We got to the road in that fashion. But I did not want to leave. There seemed to be something missing. I stayed motionless with La Gorda on my back and made a very special tapping sound Don Juan had taught me. He had said that it was the call of moths. In order to produce it one had to use the inside edge of the left hand and the lips. As soon as I made it everything seemed to come to rest peacefully. The 4 entities answered me, and as they did I knew it were the ones that would go with me. I then walked to the car and eased La Gorda off my back onto the driver's seat and pushed her over to her side. We drove away in absolute silence. Something had touched me somewhere and my thoughts had been turned off. La Gorda suggested that we go to Don Gennaro's place instead of driving to her house. She said that Benigno, Nestor and Pedlito lived there but they were out of town. Her suggestion appealed to me. Once we were in the house La Gorda lit a lantern. The place looked just as it had the last time I had visited Don Gennaro. We sat on the floor. I pulled up a bench and put my writing pad on it. I was not tired and I wanted to write but I could not do it. I could not write at all. "What did the Nagual tell you about the Allies?" I asked. My question seemed to catch her off guard. She did not know how to answer. "I can't think," she finally said. It was as though she had never experienced that state before. She paced back and forth in front of me. Tiny beads of perspiration had formed on the tip of her nose and on her upper lip. She suddenly grabbed me by the hand and practically pulled me out of the house. She led me to a nearby ravine and there she got sick. My stomach felt queasy. She said that the pull of the Allies had been too great and that I should force myself to throw up. I stared at her, waiting for a further explanation. She took my head in her hands and stuck her finger down my throat, with the certainty of a nurse dealing with a child, and actually made me vomit. She explained that human beings had a very delicate glow around the stomach and that glow was always being pulled by everything around. At times when the pull was too great, as in the case of contact with the Allies, or even in the case of contact with strong people, the glow would become agitated, change color or even fade altogether. In such instances the only thing one could do was simply to throw up. I felt better but not quite myself yet. I had a sense of tiredness, of heaviness around my eyes. We walked back to the house. As we reached the door, LaGuardia sniffed the air like a dog and said that she knew which allies were mine. Her statement, which ordinarily would have had no other significance than the one she alluded to, or the one I myself read into it, had the special quality of a cathartic device. It made me explode into thoughts. All at once, my usual intellectual deliberations came into being. I felt myself leaping in the air, as if thoughts had an energy of their own. The first thought that came to my mind was that the Allies were actual entities, as I had suspected without ever daring to admit it, even to myself. I had seen them and felt them and communicated with them. I was euphoric. I embraced LaGuardia and began to explain to her the crux of my intellectual dilemma. I had seen the Allies without the aid of Don Juan or Don Gennaro, and that act made all the difference in the world to me. I told LaGuardia that once when I had reported to Don Juan that I had seen one of the Allies, he had laughed and urged me not to take myself so seriously and to disregard what I had seen. I had never wanted to believe I was having hallucinations, but I did not want to accept that there were Allies, either. My rational background was unbending. I could not bridge the gap. This time, however, everything was different, and the thought that there were actually beings on this earth that were from another world without being aliens to the earth was more than I could bear. I said to LaGuardia, half in jest, that secretly I would have given anything to be crazy. That would have absolved some part of me from the crushing responsibility of revamping my understanding of the world. The irony of it was that I could not have been more willing to revamp my understanding of the world, on an intellectual level, that is. But that was not enough. That had never been enough. And that had been my insurmountable obstacle all along, my deadly flaw. I had been willing to dally in Don Juan's world in a semi-convinced fashion, therefore, I had been a quasi-sorcerer. All my efforts had been no more than my inane eagerness to fence with the intellect, as if I were in academia where one can do that very thing from 8:00 a.m. to 5:00 p.m., at which time, duly tired, one goes home. Don Juan used to say as a joke that, after arranging the world in a most beautiful and enlightened manner, the scholar goes home at 5 o'clock in order to forget his beautiful arrangement. While LaGuardia made us some food, I worked feverishly on my notes. I felt much more relaxed after reading. LaGuardia was in the best of spirits. She clowned, the way Don Gennaro used to, imitating the gestures I made while I wrote. "What do you know about the Allies, Guardia?" I asked. "Only what the Nagual told me," she replied. "He said that the Allies were forces that a sorcerer learned to control. He had two inside his gourd and so did Gennaro." "How did they keep them inside their gourds?" "No one knows that. All the Nagual knew was that a tiny, perfect gourd with a neck must be found before one could harness the Allies." "Where can one find that kind of gourd?" "Anywhere. The Nagual left word with me, in case we survived the attack of the Allies, that we should start looking for the perfect gourd, which must be the size of the thumb of the left hand. That was the size of the Nagual's gourd." "Have you seen his gourd?" "No. Never. The Nagual said that a gourd of that kind is not in the world of men. It's like a little bundle that one can distinguish hanging from their belts. But if you deliberately look at it you will see nothing. The gourd, once it is found, must be groomed with great care. Usually sorcerers find gourds like that on vines in the woods. They pick them and dry them and then they hollow them out. And then they smooth them and polish them. Once the sorcerer has his gourd he must offer it to the Allies and entice them to live there. If the Allies consent, The gourd disappears from the world of men and the allies become an aid to the sorcerer. The Nagwal and Jenna could make their allies do anything that needed to be done. Things they themselves could not do. Such as, for instance, sending the wind to chase me or sending that chicken to run inside Lydia's blouse. I heard a peculiar, prolonged hissing sound outside the door. It was the exact sound I had heard in Donna Soledad's house 2 days before. This time I knew it was the jaguar. The sound did not scare me. In fact, I would have stepped out to see the jaguar had La Gorda not stopped me. "You're still incomplete," she said. "The allies would feast on you if you go out by yourself. Especially that daring one that's prowling out there now." "My body feels very safe," I protested. She patted my back and held me down against the bench on which I was writing. "You're not a complete sorcerer yet," she said. "You have a huge patch in your middle and the force of those allies would yank it out of place. They are no joke. What are you supposed to do when an ally comes to you in this fashion?" "I don't bother with them one way or another. The Nagwal taught me to be balanced and not to seek anything eagerly. Tonight, for instance, I knew which allies would go to you. If you can never get a gourd and groom it, you may be eager to get them. I'm not. Chances are I'll never get them myself. They are a pain in the neck." "Why?" "Because they are forces and as such they can drain you to nothing. The Nagwal said that one is better off with nothing except one's purpose and freedom. Someday when you're complete, perhaps we'll have to choose whether or not to keep them." I told her that I personally liked the jaguar even though there was something overbearing about it. She peered at me. There was a look of surprise and bewilderment in her eyes. "I really like that one," I said. "Tell me what you saw," she said. I realized at that moment that I had automatically assumed that she had seen the same things I had. I described in great detail the 4 allies as I had seen them. She listened more than attentively, she appeared to be spellbound by my description. "The allies have no form," she said when I had finished. "They are like a presence, like a wind, like a glow. The first one we found tonight was a blackness that wanted to get inside my body. That's why I screamed. I felt it reaching up my legs. The others were just colors. Their glow was so strong, though, that it made the trail look as if it were daytime." Her statements astounded me. I had finally accepted, after years of struggle and purely on the basis of our encounter with them that night, that the allies had a consensual form, a substance which could be perceived equally by everyone's senses. I jokingly told La Gorda that I had already written in my notes that they were creatures with form. "What am I going to do now?" I asked in a rhetorical sense. "It's very simple," she said. "Write that they are not." I thought that she was absolutely right. "Why do I see them as monsters?" I asked. "That's no mystery," she said. "You haven't lost your human form yet. The same thing happened to me. I used to see the allies as people, all of them were Indian men with horrible faces and mean looks. They used to wait for me in deserted places. I thought they were after me as a woman. The Nagwal used to laugh his head off at my fears. But still I was half dead with fright. One of them used to come and sit on my bed and shake it until I would wake up. The fright that ally used to give me was something that I don't want repeated, even now that I'm changed. Tonight I think I was as afraid of the allies as I used to be." "You mean that you don't see them as human beings anymore?" "No. Not anymore. The Nagwal told you that an ally is formless. He is right. An ally is only a presence, a helper that is nothing, and yet it is as real as you and me." "Have the little sisters seen the allies?" "Everybody has seen them one time or another." "Are the allies just a force for them too?" "No. They are like you, they haven't lost their human form yet. None of them has. For all of them, the little sisters, the Genros and Soledad, the allies are horrendous things. With them the allies are malevolent, dreadful creatures of the night. The sole mention of the allies sends Lydia and Josefina and Pablito into a frenzy. Rosa and Nestor are not that afraid of them, but they don't want to have anything to do with them, either. Benigno has his own designs, so he's not concerned with them. They don't bother him, or me, for that matter. But the others are easy prey for the Allies, especially now that the Allies are out of the Naguals and Gennaro's gourds. They come all the time looking for you. The Nagual told me that as long as one clings to the human form, one can only reflect that form, and since the Allies feed directly onto our life force in the middle of the stomach, they usually make us sick, and then we see them as heavy, ugly creatures. Is there something that we can do to protect ourselves, or to change the shape of those creatures? What all of you have to do is lose your human forms. What do you mean? My question did not seem to have any meaning for her. She stared at me blankly as if waiting for me to clarify what I had just said. She closed her eyes for a moment. You don't know about the human mold and the human form, do you? She asked. I stared at her. I've just seen that you know nothing about them, she said and smiled. You are absolutely right, I said. The Nagual told me that the human form is a force, she said. And the human mold is, well, a mold. He said that everything has a particular mold. Plants have molds, animals have molds, worms have molds. Are you sure the Nagual never showed you the human mold? I told her that he had sketched the concept, but in a very brief manner, once when he had tried to explain something about a dream I had had. In the dream in question I had seen a man who seemed to be concealing himself in the darkness of a narrow gully. To find him there scared me. I looked at him for a moment and then the man stepped forward and made himself visible to me. He was naked and his body glowed. He seemed to be delicate, almost frail. I liked his eyes. They were friendly and profound. I thought that they were very kind. But then he stepped back into the darkness of the gully and his eyes became like two mirrors, like the eyes of a ferocious animal. Don Juan said that I had encountered the human mold in dreaming. He explained that sorcerers have the avenue of their dreaming to lead them to the mold, and that the mold of men was definitely an entity which could be seen by some of us at certain times when we are imbued with power, and by all of us for sure at the moment of our death. He described the mold as being the source, the origin of man, since, without the mold to group together the force of life, there was no way for that force to assemble itself into the shape of man. He interpreted my dream as a brief and extraordinarily simplistic glance at the mold. He said that my dream had restated the fact that I was a simple-minded and very earthy man. La Gorda laughed and said that she would have said the same thing herself. To see the mold as an average naked man and then as an animal had been indeed a very simplistic view of the mold. Perhaps it was just a stupid, ordinary dream, I said, trying to defend myself. No, she said with a large grin. You see, the human mold glows and it is always found in water holes and narrow gullies. Why in gullies and water holes? I asked. It feeds on water. Without water there is no mold, she replied. I know that the Nagual took you to water holes regularly in hopes of showing Jan the mold. But your emptiness prevented you from seeing anything. The same thing happened to me. He used to make me lie naked on a rock in the very center of a particular dried-up water hole, but all I did was to feel the presence of something that scared me out of my wits. Why does emptiness prevent one from seeing the mold? The Nagual said that everything in the world is a force, a pull or a push. In order for us to be pushed or pulled we need to be like a sail, like a kite in the wind. But if we have a hole in the middle of our luminosity, the force goes through it and never acts upon us. The Nagual told me that Gennaro liked you very much and tried to make you aware of the hole in your middle. He used to fly his sombrero as a kite to tease you, he even pulled you from that hole until you had diarrhea, but you never caught on to what he was doing. Why didn't they tell me as plainly as you have told me? They did, but you didn't notice their words. I found her statement impossible to believe. To accept that they had told me about it and I had not acknowledged it was unthinkable. Did you ever see the mold? Gorda? I asked. Sure, when I became complete again. I went to that particular water hole one day by myself and there it was. It was a radiant, luminous being. I could not look at it. It blinded me. But being in its presence was enough. I felt happy and strong. And nothing else mattered, nothing. Just being there was all I wanted. The Nagwal said that sometimes if we have enough personal power we can catch a glimpse of the mold even though we are not sorcerers. When that happens we say that we have seen God. He said that if we call it God it is the truth. The mold is God. I had a dreadful time understanding the Nagwal, because I was a very religious woman. I had nothing else in the world but my religion. So to hear the Nagwal say the things he used to say made me shiver. But then I became complete and the forces of the world began to pull me, and I knew that the Nagwal was right. The mold is God. What do you think? The day I see it I'll tell you, Gorda, I said. She laughed, and said that the Nagwal used to make fun of me, saying that the day I would see the mold I would probably become a Franciscan friar, because in the depths of me I was a religious soul. Was the mold you saw a man or a woman? I asked. Neither. It was simply a luminous human. The Nagwal said that I could have asked something for myself. That a warrior cannot let that chance pass. But I could not think of anything to ask for. It was better that way. I have the most beautiful memory of it. The Nagwal said that a warrior with enough power can see the mold many, many times. What a great fortune that must be. But if the human mold is what puts us together, what is the human form? Something sticky, a sticky force that makes us the people we are. The Nagwal told me that the human form has no form. Like the allies that he carried in his gourd, it's anything, but in spite of not having form, it possesses us during our lives and doesn't leave us until we die. I've never seen the human form but I have felt it in my body. She then described a very complex series of sensations that she had had over a period of years that culminated in a serious illness, the climax of which was a bodily state that reminded me of descriptions I had read of a massive heart attack. She said that the human form, as the force that it is, left her body after a serious internal battle that manifested itself as illness. It sounds as if you had a heart attack, I said. Maybe I did, she replied, but one thing I know for sure. The day I had it, I lost my human form. I became so weak that for days I couldn't even get out of my bed. Since that day I haven't had the energy to be my old self. From time to time I have tried to get into my old habits, but I didn't have the strength to enjoy them the way I used to. Finally I gave up trying. What is the point of losing your form? A warrior must drop the human form in order to change, to really change. Otherwise there is only talk about change, like in your case. The Nagwal said that it is useless to think or hope that one can change one's habits. One cannot change one iota as long as one holds on to the human form. The Nagwal told me that a warrior knows that he cannot change, and yet he makes it his business to try to change, even though he knows that he won't be able to. That's the only advantage a warrior has over the average man. The warrior is never disappointed when he fails to change. But you are still yourself, Gorda, aren't you? No. Not anymore. The only thing that makes you think you are yourself is the form. Once it leaves, you are nothing. But you still talk and think and feel as you always did, don't you? Not at all. I'm new,